quickly. Well, I became a minister because I wanted to serve the people. But, Joe, it's a complex answer that's required. I would say that you've got to take into account the history and the context. The fact that in a country such as ours, a lot of people have come into power and they've had nothing. And there's nothing in the bank account, not even a bank account. Extended family to look after. No asset, no house. You get that out of government. There are people out there with no jobs. And what we've seen in South Africa has happened in every part of the world, where politics now, when you're in power, can actually solve a lot of those material problems. We were idealistic and we thought as the party, ANC and Communist Party, that we could overcome those problems in South Africa. But we found that it's been very, very difficult. So I think, in short, that's the answer. The technical aspect, funnily enough, coming here and trying to think of the type of metaphor, I thought of the very one you did, but I haven't used it. And that is with this legislation that's coming now, in this country and others, post-Wikileaks. It is plugging the damn wall after it's broken. I had another metaphor of closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. And the problem with our Protection Act that's coming through now, so much of it, which is so focused on secrecy, and it's the same in a lot of countries, is actually passé. And I gave you that example. For instance, if we took a photograph of a building in this country, a military barracks or whatever, you get into big trouble. But now it's on Google Earth. To the lady, I would think, fairly young at the time, the unfortunate time when Conduct was killed. I didn't know about the spy network that you referred to of the Swedish Social Democrats, who are set up internationally as an ideal, the sort of party squeaky clean, etc. I am aware from our own situation as political parties, especially in the struggle period, and others, where there's a case to have a structure that protects people. So it's for security purposes, and I would think virtually every party has something of that like. But if it descends into something of the nature you talk about, and it's really carrying out surveillance operations of that kind and using the nefarious examples, that's just the example I'm making of what happens with states. And they're institutions that descend down that slippery slope because they lose sight of what is right and what is wrong.
How well? You want to?
I'm going to respond further to that.
No, please do.
But if I understand the question of the lady in the back, I think you were asking about what the status is of the WikiLeaks related cases in the U.S., prosecutions in the U.S., and the European case that I described, or other cases, what is lacking there. I hope I got that right. With regard to WikiLeaks, the alleged leaker, who has not been prosecuted yet, as probably many people know, most people know, Bradley Manning, who was initially held in a military barracks in conditions that were criticized by many, including actually by a government spokesperson in what he thought was a confidential statement in a confidential meeting, and he was summarily sacked or asked to resign the next day. So that was certainly very controversial in the U.S., and there are a number of allegations that the reasons why he was held in the conditions that he was held in was to try to get him to essentially turn on Julian Assange so that there would be a basis for a prosecution related to conspiracy. Not clear that that's happened. It seems pretty unlikely that it has, given that any attempt to prosecute Julian Assange seems to have fallen apart in the U.S. Bradley Manning has now been charged under the Espionage Act. Definitely there's been some criticism in the United States about the charges that have been levied against him. He's still been detained, and the prosecution, the trial has not started yet, and it doesn't appear to be imminent. Regarding the question of the European case that I mentioned, which I think is the Guja versus Moldova case, or other cases that were mentioned, I would just highlight that in the process of developing these principles, there's a number of different people who have been doing research and analysis to try to understand what the current state of the law is and what the best practices of the law is. I'm happy to provide people information for where there has been research that's been helpful and that might be helpful in your contexts. I will say that there's a lot of hard cases out there. There's definitely a lot of bad law, and there's some good law. And on the eve of the vote on the Protection of Information Bill in South Africa, I think it behooves me to say also that South Africa historically, at least in post-democracy, South Africa has really been a model for the world of what good law, good human rights practice within the Constitution can look like. And we would hope to see in the future South African law and South African practice on the crux of freedom of information and national security really represent some of the best practices, and I know that there's been some concerns that have been raised about that. So.
In short, concerning the role of the editor in relation to online publication, it's supposed to be the same as an editor of a TV program or a radio show. But I think if you look at, there are not so many cases dealing with online publications. I can't say any specifically about how it works in practice, but if you look at the old system, I mean, it's fairly clear that an editor doesn't always know every single word of a written paper. So the fact that an editor may be sued or may be prosecuted and may even be surprised about details in the content is not entirely new. So it's supposed to work in the same way for online companies. But of course, with the Wikileaks situation, it would have been extremely interesting to see how it would have stood up, so to speak. We have to wait, I think, for real details on that. I confirm what was said about this spy ring and network or allegations against two individual journalists and one informant that took place in 1973-1974. They imagined that they would also refer to the editor, but due to the fact that they were charged with espionage, they weren't allowed to do that. On that particular point, the law has then been changed, and today they wouldn't be prosecuted for espionage. There are some technical legal requirements that have been changed, but the history as such occurred in the way it was presented here. But in that relation, I would like to comment what you said about murders in Sweden and in Norway. I don't think you can blame that on open public administration and transparency. Those are two different issues. If there is anything common with those two well-known leading politicians who were murdered in Sweden in 17 years, what they may have in common is that both were walking quite openly in the city of Stockholm and without protection, and maybe that is something that has to change, because this lack of distance between politicians and the public maybe is not secure anymore in the modern times. But that has nothing to do with public administration as such. Concerning the massacre in Norway, I don't think anyone blames the open administration. Maybe what happened was that the police reacted slowly, but I mean, no one expected a bunch of young future-to-be politicians to be protected by a massive police force before this happened. It was unimaginable. I agree with you that the internet as such may create greater risks for nutters acting in this way, but I don't think you can blame what you say, open society or transparency for these regretful events. Concerning Wikileaks, I just may add, as most of you probably know, concerning what will happen to Julian Assange, we're still awaiting some judgment from the Court of Second Instance in the United Kingdom, and apart from that, I don't know all those cases as well as you presented them, but I have the same view on as far as I know. Yeah.